Hello, I'm Derek, and I'm here to talk to you about PHP 8 today. I would have liked to be in Verona with you, but instead I'm going to have to do this here from my office. In the next 30 minutes I'll be giving you a quick introduction to PHP 8. So hi, I'm Derek, I'm a European living in London. I'm PHP 7.4's release manager, although I'll be talking about PHP 8 today. I also wrote Xdebug and PHP's date and time support. If you have never heard of Xdebug, please go type it into Google and figure out what it is all about. I also host a PHP Internals news podcast with the latest news about everything that's going on in PHP's development, where every week, or nearly every week, I will talk to a PHP developer about new features that are going to make it into the language. I like maps, I like beer, I like whiskey, and all of these things are going to come back during the rest of this presentation in examples. Alright, having said that, let's get started. So, PHP 7.4 already added to PHP's typing system with things like types for properties. So you can now say that you have a public property called age, a protected property called distillery, and so on and so on. So this is new in PHP 7.4. You can also set on static properties, you can have default values for them, and you can even have them more on the same line. Now this is nothing new, but in the last few years PHP has gone from just having type hints to having an actual typing system, and PHP 8 continues to build on top of that. So whereas PHP 7.4 got these things like contravariant types and covariant, contravariant arguments and covariant return types, and more of these things have been added to PHP. Now it might come to no surprise that in PHP 8 these things are going to be extended again by new things. So first of all, let's have a look at this specific API. In this case, we want to store a number, but we want to store both an integer number as well as a floating point number. And how you can deal with this in PHP 7.4 and earlier is by, you have to use doc blocks, right? There's no way in the language itself to define these types. So PHP 8 extends having single property types and argument types to something called union types, which means you can now define a union of two types directly where you would originally have defined only the single type. So we can have int or float number as a private property. We can have as both in set number to set the new number, and both of these types are now going to be allowed. This is actually something that PHP internally does for lots of things already. PHP, unlike userland, PHP's internal functions, unlike userland, already use these type of union types internally. So if you, for example, have the microtime function, depending on the Boolean argument get as float, it will return either a string or a floating point number. Similarly, for example, the implode function, as first argument, you can either give it a string or an array. If you would have passed anything outside a string or an array, you would have gotten an error. But of course in userland you couldn't do that yet. Now in PHP 8 you can do this, which also adds to PHP's internal type checking for its internal functions, makes that better and easier to use as well. And now also the same as what PHP internals already could do, for example. Now a little tiny extension to this is that you can now also have an extra comma at the end of argument types, which, as you can see in the bottom here, makes actually a lot of sense to do, because now the arguments to function themselves can become much longer because you can have multiple types, for example. So there is some trickery involved with having cursive types as in case you don't have strict types turned on. I won't go through all the examples in this slide, but what you should expect is that it behaves exactly like you would expect it to, which is always a good thing, of course. Now, PHP 8 also introduces a union type of its own called mixed. And mixed is a type that is the union between array, bool, callable, int, float, null, object, resource, and string. And the reason for adding this type specifically is that it allows you that while upgrading code, you can distinguish between I haven't added the type yet, or it really accepts any value. Which means that if you see this code later again, you say that, well, oh, I didn't look at what this function could actually return, for example, what arguments it accepts. But now you can use mixed there, so you can distinguish between that. So this is just a normal union type, but predefined for you. It also follows all the STR invariant rules, meaning that if you would create an extended function, you can't suddenly accept fewer arguments to methods, because that would invalidate the variant rules that PHP 7.4 introduced already. If you have not added a missing return type declaration to a function, then this is assumed to be mixed void, which again is a union of a union, mixed, and void. And you need to be careful with that, because if you create an inherited method from this, you can't suddenly start returning something that doesn't have a type return if the parent class has a mixed return type, because mixed and void is larger than mixed, which wouldn't follow the original variance rules. So you need to be careful with that. Now, because types are being added to properties, and we can now have union types in here as well, sometimes these lines are going to get very long. And if you want to accept, say, these 4 types, well, how would you do that? Well, if you want to have a constructor that sets all of them, you can see already this line is too long to even fit on my slide, right? You need to type the types at least twice and the property names at least 4 times, which is in a constructor definition in the line with arguments. You'd have to do this argument equals argument, as well as also defining the properties themselves. In PHP 8, you can get away with this by specifying the visibility in the arguments to the constructor. So instead of defining the properties now separately in the class, you actually define them in a constructor, and this creates syntactic sugar that then will do in a constructor the assignments for you and also define the properties with the right visibility and the right type. So this is a lot less to type, and for certain occasions, such as data value objects, actually really quite useful, because you can reduce the amount of code that you have to type. And I know that some IDEs help you with that, but of course not all of them do. Now similarly, if you have defined a constructor with these properties and defaults like this, say this is a value object that defines settings. Now how would I create such a value setting where I keep all the defaults, but I don't want to sort the fields by whiskey, but instead by distillery, for example? Now how would I do that? Well, the only way how you can do that in PHP 7.4 and early is by also defining all the previous values, right? So some examples here. If you just see this line, new settings false, true, false. If you look at this, you have no idea what this means. You actually do need to look at the properties that you have defined to know what false, true, and false actually stand for. Similarly, as I said, if you want to sort not by whiskey, but instead by rating, you're still going to have to repeat all the previous arguments first as well, which isn't particularly handy. Now PHP 8 solves this by introducing named arguments. So in named arguments, instead of having to use the values of arguments in a position, you can just specify the name for it. So instead of, well, in this case it would have been a silly example because you could just have passed in false, but at least now by writing the include distillery code on false, you know exactly what that false actually meant, without you having to look up the properties, because the name of the property is already defined right here. And similarly, the other example where you just want to sort by rating, you don't have to pass in all of the previous arguments to the constructor, and you can now just do the field that you want. Now you do need to be a little bit careful with named arguments, is because if you write code for that other people consume, like libraries, it suddenly means that all your argument names for all public APIs are now sort of going to be locked in, because if you change them, that means that people that called it with the old name will now get an error because the property name does no longer exist, which isn't great. So now is a great time to go through your APIs and to make sure that everything that is publicly visible has the right name. And we are the same thing doing for PHP itself, because there's so many options with so many argument names that haven't really been standardized, or just R or A or I and things like that. So yeah, that is a big thing to do, but it is going to be worth it. Another heavily discussed subject in PHP 8 is attributes. So attributes are a way that used to be called annotations, or in this case specifically doctrine annotations. And doctrine annotations are a way of adding some metadata to either class names or argument names or property names or calls and things like that. And they're all done in something called a doc block in this case, right? A doc block starts with slash, star, star, and ends with star, slash. And although this is very nice, it is very tricky to validate, because this is not syntax, so PHP doesn't know what to do with this. PHP 8 introduces attributes that, instead of you having to write this in doc blocks where PHP doesn't validate the syntax, instead there is a new bit of syntax that is actually defined and parsed by PHP. So these are called attributes, and they start with a hash or a pound sign, and then it is between square brackets. And so in this case, this should reflect the exact same thing as previously, but attributes add some extra benefits. To have a look at what those attributes actually say, like the thing that you have in here is actually the name of a class. It is the name of the class with fully qualified class name as doctrine ORM attributes column, because it follows the same use rules as I have here. What we can do with this class is we'll get back to in a moment. The thing behind the attribute name that we have inside the square brackets is called the constructor arguments. And I see that I made a slight typo here. This square bracket that we have here should have been behind the parentheses closing. My apologies for that. Even though this is recorded, I still have some mistakes. Now, to use these attributes, you can use these through reflection. So the top example here, I have pretty much the same example as on the previous slide, except that I only kept one attribute here where I have ORM column string. So this is basically defines the my ORM attributes column attribute on the private property name. As I mentioned, these columns, or this column thing, is actually a class, and you have to define this class to make use of this. And you have to define this class and mark it with the attribute, which is what we have here in a second example. So this is just a normal class that lives in your normal PSA4 autoload repositories and so on and so on. And it uses attributes. An attribute is a built-in PHP class that denotes that a specific class can be used as an attribute. There are some other extra options that you can also set on this attribute, but I don't have enough time to go into that today. Now, with those two classes together, the way how you use this is by using reflection. And this is likely something that other tools are going to do, like Doctrine. Instead of relying on the doc blocks, it will now do this internally and rely on the attributes that are new, or at some point maybe with an upcoming new version. And the way how you reflect on this name private property is by first calling a reflection property on name. And then we do a for each over this. So we have rp get attribute that lists all the attributes that are found on name. In this case, we only have this column one, of course. We can echo the name. We can get all the arguments that then returns the arguments of this attribute, so in this case that would be string, and then we can create a new instance. And when you call new instance, PHP will actually instantiate the myORM attributes column class and feeds it in the arguments that were being set on the attributes. So that feeds in the string as the argument to the constructor. And now you have this attribute class, then you can do auto validation. But this is all designed to make sure that if you, for example, mistyped ORM column as something else, then the attribute can't be found. And the tool that makes use of this can, for example, get an error here. So everything is designed to make sure that this is now all syntax, it's validated by PHP, and it is architectured in such a way that making typos is going to give you a warning much sooner, because it is now no longer specifically an attribute, and you can't set an attribute on a class that hasn't been defined with the attribute, if that makes sense. And then the result of this little script here will be the following, so not particularly interesting. So where are these attributes? What is the use case? Well, I've already covered, for example, doctrine ORM, but there's also cases where you can set up routes for Symfony or Laravel, things like that. Or maybe at some point PHP will get internal attributes such as deprecated that will throw a deprecation warning whenever this method is called or this property is being used. Or maybe at some point in the future we see attributes called JIT and no-JIT that can signal the JIT engine in PHP, which I'll get back to later, whether a specific method should not be JITted or should be JITted very specifically. Again, we will see where that goes in the future. Okay, let's move on to a few other new features in PHP 8. And the first one I want to draw attention to is the new match expression. So the match expression is an update to the switch statement. Sometimes, depending on the value of a enumeration, in this case we have an example where we have an SQL statement where it can either be tselect, tupdate, or delete. And if we want to get a statement out here, you basically have to make a case statement or a set of case statements. Why do statement equals this select statement and then a break? And you have to repeat that statement equals for every case that you want to do. Now what the match expression allows you to do is assign the value of something that is being matched to a variable. So let's have a look at how this example looks like with a match expression. As you can see, it's already a lot shorter, right? So we only have dollar statements equals once, and we do that before match. So match, again, like switch, defined or depends on the type. And on the left-hand side, we have lexer, tselect, lexer, tupdate, and tdelete, which are the three case statements that we have or had, and then also default. On the right-hand side of the arrow, there is a single statement. So basically what this does is that if lexer lookahead type is lexer tselect, then statement will be set to the value that this select statement evaluates to. There's a few other benefits by using the match statement. It is an expression, so it returns a value. Match doesn't do type juggling, so where switch juggles between the type of the value that you're passing in and the case statement, match doesn't do that. It only does strict type checking, which actually can be really, really useful. There's no automatic fall through, so you can't forget to use break, for example, because on the right hand side of the arrow you can at the moment only use a single statement. It is possible that in the future it is going to be possible to have multiple statements here, but that would fit in the same category as allowing multiple statements for the short array syntax that PHP 7.4 introduced with the fn keyword. The match statement will also throw an exception if none of the cases match, which we can't have in this example here because we have the default case, but if the default was missing and we would pass in 42, for example, it will throw an invalid value exception to show you that, well, we have a match on something that we didn't know how to handle. Another cool new feature is the NoSafe Operator. And what the NoSafe Operator allows you to do is instead of having to write this cumbersome if session is not null, access the user property. If user is a null, call getAddress method on it, and then if address is a null, access the country property of the address, which is kind of cumbersome to use. What PHP 8 allows you to do is to use the NoSafe operator here, which means that you can rewrite the top example to the bottom one. And the NoSafe operator is the question mark error operator, as you can see here. And this operator basically means that if session equals null, then return null. And then don't call any of the other properties, accessors, or methods. If session isn't null, then we access the user. Now, and so on and so on. So if user is null, then we return null back to country. If it is set to an object in this case, we call getAddress on it, and so on and so on. So this kind of short circuiting, as this is called, saves you end up quite a lot of code to write, and it also makes it a lot easier to read, because you know that the result of country is always going to be either null or a country, without you having to pass lots of extra logic in between that you might not want to do, and there's lots of nested if levels as well that will all disappear. So yeah, this short circuiting requires a little bit more explanation perhaps. So with this line above, I've prepared a few statements. So if session format is null, that should say session user is null, null is passed to, oh sorry, no, this is correct. If session format is null, null is passed to getAddress. So this NoSafe operator stands aside from the NoSafe operators that are used in the chain. The argument is its own chain in this case. If session user equals null, then getAddress would never be called. Also, that means that the arguments that are being fed in would also never be called if there would have been a method call in there. If getAddress returns null, country will be null. So those are the three statements. It all sort of going to behave as you expect it to behave. There's a bunch of smaller string functions as well, or smaller and other functions. So the new string functions in PHP 8 are STR Contains, STR Starts With, and Ends With. These were originally suggested for PHP 7.4, but in multiple variants. So there were multi-byte variants and case-insensitive variants, whereas in PHP 8 we only have these three new functions. They don't do case-insensitive searches. There is not a multi-byte variant for them, so always use UTF-8. And these are pretty much shortcuts for doing more complicated searches. Like if you want to do string starts with in PHP, you can do that, but you first need to take the substring of the needle with 0 and the length of it, and to make sure that the argument is null and not false. And instead of this more complicated thing to have to build yourself, PHP 8 introduces these three minor functions, but they pack quite a bit of a useful value. Another thing that PHP 8 adds is the WeakMap. And a WeakMap is a way of being able to store metadata for objects without preventing PHP's memory manager from removing the associated memory if that object would go out of scope. PHP uses a reference counted model, which means that if, for example, you want to, in caching layer, you want to associate some metadata with an object, you have to store the object itself in the table in some way. But the moment you do that, PHP's memory management can no longer free up that memory because there's still this reference to it. Well, a WeakMap doesn't behave like that. You can use an object as an array key into a WeakMap, in the first example here. And then when the object is freed up, either by unset or it goes out of scope, it will also automatically get removed from the WeakMap. Meaning that as long as there is still a reference, you can access it through the WeakMap, but otherwise not. And this makes a lot of sense in caching layers, as you can see in the second example, where I have the class foobar with a cache WeakMap, And if we then call get something with caching, we pass in the object. If this object is already set in the cache, then we can just return what is in there. If not, we can then set this compute something expensive to the cache object and be done with it. And as long as the object itself that is being passed into get something with caching stays in scope, the cache will be used, and otherwise it will not be. So this is a way of storing this metadata with objects without preventing PHP's memory manager from freeing up the memory itself. Moving on. In PHP 8 there's a lot of warnings in PHP's internal functions that have been converted to value error exceptions. This only happens for the places where it was a coding error. So for example, the array fill method, a prototype, you give it a starting index, you give it the amount of elements, and then the value that you want to fill the array with. Now the number here, the int type, can't require you to only have positive numbers. So it is not illegal to pass in a negative number here. However, that logically makes no sense because you can't insert something that is negative 100 elements. That just makes no sense, right? Whereas in PHP 7.4 you get a warning saying the number of elements can be negative. In PHP 8 you will get a value error that you then catch with a catch statement. So in this case you get a value error saying array fill argument to num must be greater than or equal to 0. But this conversion is only being done for actual coding errors and not for transient errors, because we don't want to break people's code where sometimes, depending on external resources, your code starts failing. And only where the code itself was demonstratively wrong will you get this exception. In some cases you don't actually need the exception itself. I mean, there's a few cases where it is perfectly okay to throw an error and not care about what exception is actually being called. PHP 8 allows you to remove the variable from the catch exception. Yeah, and that's pretty much what this feature is. So that's not really lots, but it is kind of useful. The biggest thing probably in PHP 8, and it's perhaps curious that I left it to last, is the JustinTime Compiler. So the JustinTime Compiler adds an extra step to PHP's engine to instead not stop at bytecode, but instead compile PHP bytecode down to x86 machine code. And this is done for specific bits of code where the performance improvement can be really, really high. And that is usually in the cases where you have very mild heavy code. The JustinTime Compiler is part of Opcache. You have to turn it on, which you do by on, and you need to give it a memory size. In this case we have it called 128. We have given it 128 megabytes. What the JustinTime Compiler does is that it will analyze the PHP code that is being run, and if it notices that a specific bit of code is run quite a lot, or at least more than a few times, it will then start converting this to machine code. And then the next call to this method, it will use the machine code directly, if possible to do. And that, as I said, for mild heavy code should speed up things quite a lot. However, it will only really do a lot for mild heavy code. In most use cases, or in most other cases, I don't expect this actually to bring a lot of performance. I'm going to guess it's going to be between a negative 5% and 5%. But it's all going to depend on your use case and what your application actually runs. Now, when is PHP 8 going to go out? Coming out, it's going to be November 26, 2020. Hopefully, because you know what deadlines sometimes when they slip. But the PHP project has been pretty good releasing the 0.0 releases on time. So we have to wait for November 26 for running it in production, but of course it's already possible to run PHP 8's betas and soon our release candidates to try out your project with, and you absolutely should do that. If you want to learn more about PHP internals development, have a follow at the phpinternals.news podcast, where about every week I will have a new episode. At the moment there's a little bit of a break because they are PHP feature freeze now, so nothing new is coming in. But once feature freeze is lifted and we get ready for PHP 8.1, I'm going to pick up and continue to cover the new features that make it into PHP or sometimes don't make it into PHP. Now it is time for some questions, which I think we can do in the chat or in some other way that we have done. But having said that, thank you very much for attending, and I'll hope to see you at some point in the future. Hello! I hope that went well. You can see him standing in front of your lovely arena here in Verona. But I'm not there, of course, today.
All right. Thank you, Derick, for your talk. So we already have one question on the pipeline. I think you can read it from the chat. You already have it.
Yes, exactly. So actually there are two questions. The first one's by Eugenio Carocci, if I pronounce that correctly. I probably do not. And he's asking, is the introduction of named arguments a problem for libraries owners? I mean, since clients can directly refer to the named argument, this automatically becomes part of the interface exposed by the library. This means that every time a named argument is changed, then a breaking change is introduced. Am I right? Yes. Yes, you are correct. Anytime a library author would change a argument name, a parameter name, that would potentially impact people that make use of that API. Now, I don't think this is too much of an issue. Most of the time, the places where people use named arguments are either going to be in like the constructor with the promoted properties that I showed, where, in my opinion, that API should have good names to begin with. Of course, that does mean that you now have to go through your code to make sure you actually have good names in there, of course. And the other places, it's like, as an API author, you can decide, of course, whether you want to make this part of your API. You can, if you really want to, say that you don't cover named arguments as part of your API and then just not care about it pretty much. I guess the nicest way is to just go through your code and make sure your arguments are named correctly. And if they are already named correctly and you change them later, that probably indicates a breaking change anyway. So I don't think that is much of a problem in that case. All right, there is another question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. If you spotted another question, feel free to answer them.
Yes, I'm eagle-eyed. I can pay attention to questions, but I'm giving a talk now. That's kind of nice this way. Stefano is asking, the warnings to exceptions can create breaking changes when moving to PHP 8. I guess when you don't already convert warnings to exceptions today. So yes, that is true. But as I indicated during the talk, the places where the warnings are changed to exceptions is broken code, not transient errors where data is wrong, or for example. So although this can create a breaking change, it is only going to be in the places where your code was broken already anyway. All right, Stefano, is there anything else? I see.
No, I think let's wait for a few seconds. Bear in mind, chat, that we have a slight delay between us and the chat, so sometimes it might seem that we are ignoring you, but no, we are just waiting for it to sync up.
That's fine. I'm quite used to doing that while streaming as well, where it takes 15 seconds. Some people are, what is it, I guess, arguing about the attribute syntax, which of course was a very interesting discussion we had on the PHP mailing list. And yeah, we ended up having the hash square bracket one. However, Gary's suggesting to add that to your APIs if you don't want to expose the named parameters, and that makes perfect sense to do. There's a question about Alessandro is asking or commenting, saying that regarding named arguments, you can check those automatically with Psalm. Yes, that is true. And they are, of course, working hard. Not only people that work on Psalm, but also PHP Stan, making sure to make all the PHP 8 features ready. And I'm doing the same with Xdebug, for example, as well. I don't even have to answer the questions. People answer the questions in the chat for me. That is brilliant.
Support the project. You can go to xdebug.org/support and you can pick whatever you fancy between GitHub, Patreon, etc. You can pay for professional support, etc. So go ahead and support this project because it's awesome. So we should all be thankful to Derick for his work.
Yep. So there's a question, when is the named argument being autoloaded? Which is actually a good question. The named arguments are not autoloaded at all. I mean, there's nothing different in named arguments compared to normal arguments. So there's no difference there. If you mean when the attributes are being autoloaded, those classes are going to be autoloaded when you call getInstance in reflection and not before that.